Ladies and gentlemen, after initially threatening to take President Trump to court, Democratic Governor of Maine Janet Mills has just completely surrendered. Now, you might remember that just a couple weeks ago, President Trump signed an executive order banning men from competing in women's sports. And just to be very clear, this wasn't some fringe controversial idea that President Trump came up with. No, a whopping 79% of Americans actually agree with President Trump on this issue. 79%. But of course, that level of bipartisan support didn't stop Maine's far-left progressive governor from throwing a fit. No, she decided that she was going to resist President Trump's executive authority. In fact, some of you might remember this little gem. Take a look.
Understand Maine. Is Maine here, the governor of Maine?
Not here.
Are you not going to comply with it?
I'm complying with state and federal laws.
We are the federal law. Well, you better do it. You better do it because you're not going to get any federal funding at all if you don't. And by the way, your population, even though it's somewhat liberal, although I did very well there, your population doesn't want men playing in women's sports. So you better comply because otherwise you're not getting any federal funding.
See you in court.
Every state, good, I'll see you in court. I look forward to that. That should be a real easy one. And enjoy your life after governor because I don't think you'll be in elected politics. Every state has a responsibility to comply with Title IX. They have an obligation, a legal obligation, and we'll be enforcing aggressively, and we're going to be protecting our citizens. We're going to protect.
So, yeah. But folks, here's the thing. As it would turn out, President Trump wasn't bluffing. As you all heard, progressive Governor Janet Mills said, "I'll see you in court." But guess what? She never even made it to court. You see, within just 2 weeks of that little scuffle taking place, President Trump hit Governor Janet Mills with the political equivalent of a freight train. You see, President Trump immediately pulled over $100 million in federal funding from Maine's public universities after Mills refused to comply with his executive order. President Trump pretty much said, if you're going to violate the civil rights of women by letting men compete in their sports, then you're not going to get a dime of taxpayer money. And you know what? That's what this radical progressive governor in Maine was doing. She was violating the civil rights of women. The reality is that letting biological men compete in women's sports not only seriously endangers women, but it also violates their civil rights. Really, it's discrimination, plain and simple. But so folks, check this out. You see, initially, progressive Democratic Governor Janet Mills up in Maine still wasn't willing to comply even after the funding had been pulled for her universities. But you see, folks, here's where President Donald Trump's infamous art of the deal entered the picture. You see, just 3 days ago, President Trump issued a 10-day ultimatum to progressive Governor Janet Mills. Comply with the executive order, or even more federal funding is going to be ripped away from the state of Maine. And you know what happened? Within 24 hours of that ultimatum being given, Governor Janet Mills capitulated completely. So now, as of yesterday afternoon, transgender athletes are officially banned from competing in women's sports in the state of Maine. So much for that whole see you in court nonsense. The truth is, Governor Janet Mills folded faster than a lawn chair. Now, folks, there's another absolutely hilarious component to all of this, but before we talk about that, I want to say real quick that if you guys enjoy the daily news coverage, please consider subscribing to the channel because it really does help a ton with my daily struggle against the YouTube algorithm. But okay, folks, let's talk about the elephant in the room here. The reality is, the second the federal taxpayer money started drying up, progressive Governor Janet Mills immediately threw her progressive values right in the dumpster where they belong. So really what that means is that despite all of the grandstanding that some of these progressives like to engage in, these progressive values really don't mean a whole lot after all when push comes to shove. But folks, let me tell you what all of this really was. This was a massive win for President Trump. Once again, he's proving that when it comes to really getting things done, there's pretty much nobody better. He didn't go on mainstream media and whine about it all day. No, he just leveraged the power of the purse. And you know what? Let's not forget that the Democrats have been using economic pressure like this for decades. For as long as anyone can remember, the Democrats have been withholding federal funding unless you submit to their crazy progressive ideology. That's pretty much their entire playbook. And now Trump is handing it right back to them. And by the way, this is the same strategic approach that President Trump is using with his tariff policy, leveraging economic tools to serve the America First agenda. And guess what? That's working too. Now, when you really stop and think about it, this entire debacle really just shows how fundamentally insincere all of these progressive politicians actually are. They all love to get up on their progressive soapbox and grandstand in front of an audience. They love to hold press conferences and tell us how brave they are for defending the country against the evil President Trump. But the second there's any kind of real consequences, they absolutely fold. No backbone, no leadership, no conviction. Also, let's just take a moment to recognize how stupid of a hill this was to die on. The reality is, 79% of Americans nationwide oppose men in women's sports. So Janet Mills decided to pick a fight with nearly 4 out of every 5 voters in America. Not a smart move. And so now, while the Democrats are busy fear-mongering and painting this as a loss for LGBTQ rights, most Americans see this for what it actually is, a massive win for women. Because for years now, progressive leadership has been completely complicit in endangering female athletes. And now, President Trump is the one that's actually standing up for them. Folks, let that sink in for a moment. For 10 years, the progressive media has been trying to paint President Trump as this sexist, misogynist monster. Meanwhile, he's the one actually sticking up for women's rights while the Democrats are trying to erase them. And folks, here's another thing. I'll tell you what, this entire situation is like a canary in the coal mine. This is all a very clear sign that this whole woke ideology is dying. And you know what? It's dying fast. Every single day, more Americans are waking up. They're rejecting this progressive insanity. They're rejecting the gaslighting, the identity politics, and the forced compliance. Here's what I think. Soon, this whole era of men in women's locker rooms, drag queen story hour, and government-funded gender theory, all of this is going to be nothing more than a bizarre and disgusting chapter in the history books. Nothing more than a cautionary tale to never vote for progressive politicians ever again. And you know what? I'm absolutely positive that these progressives will keep on kicking and screaming and melting down and having all of their crazy theatrics. But you know why? I think it's because deep down they know progressivism loses and America First wins. And you know what? That's exactly what happened here with this entire situation. President Trump drew a line in the sand. He said men are not competing in women's sports anywhere in the country, period. And you know what? He won. Progressivism failed. And so, folks, here's the final takeaway with all of this. Not only is this an absolutely decisive, dominant victory in Maine, sure, but really this is a decisive victory across the entire country, because what this does is send a message to every other progressive governor, progressive politician, regardless of where they might be in the nation. And it says, here on the MAGA side of the aisle, here on the America First side of the aisle, we're going to stand up for what we believe in, and we will not capitulate. Now, folks, before we wrap up with today's video, I want to say real quick that I've actually gone ahead and made a community Facebook page where I'll be posting additional news and updates as it relates to all of this. So if you guys use Facebook, check out the pinned comment down below and give that page a follow. But everyone, that is going to be a wrap for this one, so please go down below and drop a comment. Let me know what you think about all of this. Like the video while you're down there, that is if you like the video. As I said earlier, please consider subscribing to the channel because it really does help a ton. Thank you all very much for tuning in today, and of course, as always, stay safe.